Welcome to WhichDraft. This is Jason Mark Anderman. So today I want to give you a little sense of what the ownership, title, and risk of loss clause is. Pretty much this is an issue that comes up whenever you're buying goods. Another word for goods is deliverables. And what you're worried about here, if you're a seller, is being on the hook for something that's no longer in your control. So for instance, if the customer takes control and possession of the goods, and you no longer have any control over it, and something goes wrong and they get destroyed or damaged, you don't want to be on the hook for providing a refund or substitute goods, given that it wasn't your fault. Same thing goes true for the customer. For instance, if you expect that they're going to be shipped to you by the vendor, and during that shipping process, that's the vendor's responsibility to make sure that they're in good shape when they arrive at you. But the vendor instead says, no, that's your responsibility. As soon as it goes off the loading dock onto the common carrier's truck, you're on the hook for it. Well, you might be pretty unhappy about that if something goes wrong and you didn't expect that. So that's the kind of issue in terms of who's really in control of the goods. And this really gets sliced and diced in three different ways if you ask the question, at what point does ownership, title, and risk of loss transfer to the customer? First and foremost, the vendor is always going to think probably from shipment, and that's the time they really care about. So they'll say something like ownership of, title to, and risk of loss for the deliverables passes to party one, the customer, upon party two, the vendor's delivery of the deliverables to a nationally reputable carrier. And they expect it to be fully insured with a reputable insurer if you're a customer. That's what you want. You might want to put down, if you're the vendor, that you can invoice that insurance to the customer. Different ballgame, though, when it comes to the customer's perspective. And the customer might say, hey, I am not on the hook for this stuff until I actually get it. I get receipt of the goods, of the deliverables, at my designated facility for delivery. So until that point that I get it at my designated facility for delivery, the entire responsibility of anything going wrong with it, ownership, title, and risk of loss, stays with the shipper, in this case normally the vendor. So in this case the vendor wants to make sure that they really trust the shipping process. The last thing for really savvy customers who are going to push the envelope here is they might put into the contract a certain standard of quality for the goods. This is really common with factory equipment that needs to be installed in a production environment and meet certain standards of quality and work productively. In that case, the customer is going to say, I am not taking ownership, title to, a risk of loss for the deliverables until I accept them. And normally you want to give notice of that acceptance to the vendor in writing. A smart vendor, if they're going to agree to this clause, is going to want a particularly rigorous acceptance criteria document that specifically spells out what standard it needs to be met, as opposed to relying on the whims of the customer. So that's pretty much how these things get sliced and diced in terms of acceptance for the point of transfer of ownership, title, and risk of loss, receipt for the point of ownership, title, and risk of loss transferring, and shipment for the point where ownership, title, and risk of loss transfers. Hope that gives you a good sense of it, and thanks for using WhichDraft.